Hi guys, David here with Cascade Components. Today we're going to walk through the installation of our Kona Process 153 link on a 2019 Kona Process. Alright, so for install of the Process 153 link, you'll need to grab your tools. You'll need a torque wrench with the correct size bits. For Allen wrenches, you need a 10, 8, 6, 5, 4, and a 3 millimeter. In some cases, you might need a T25 Torx bit. You'll need a way to use that with your torque wrench. You'll need grease, and finally, a shock pump. So the first step in putting the link on your process is removing the back wheel. So we'll get that out of the way. Once your wheel's removed, just set it out of the way. All right, once your wheel's out of the way, you want to start by removing these fixing bolts. They're a 3 mil Allen wrench, and there's 3 of them. 2 of them are up here on the seat stay pivots, and the 3rd one is at the main pivot right here. So you can see they're just little bolts. We'll get all 3 of those removed. Sometimes these can be tricky to get out, so just go slow, be patient, and you'll be able to get them. Once your fixing bolts are removed, you can come back through and start to loosen the rest of your hardware. Now, I like to get everything loose before coming through and taking it all the way off. So we can start at the shock bolts. It's a 5 millimeter Allen wrench. Just back them off a turn or so. Next is the main pivot. All right, at the main pivot and the seat stay pivots, you'll want to make sure you use a wrench on the other side to back it. This prevents you from stripping out anything. The main pivot is a 10 mil on the back side and a 6 millimeter on the non-drive side. So again, loosen this up and just back it off a little bit. When you get to your seat stay pivots, it's a 8 millimeter wrench on the back, a 4 millimeter on the outside. These seat stay pivots have a tendency to want to pull through the carbon if you don't back them, so just make sure you're using 2 wrenches. Okay, once we have everything loose, we're going to come through and start removing bolts. I like to start at the seat stay bolts. So we'll remove both of these. And we'll set them aside. Once the 2 bolts are removed, we want to remove the inner part. And this is where stuff starts to get wild. You pull these out, have a firm grasp of right here. Once your bolt is pulled, pay very close attention to where the spacers and everything go, as they'll want to fly everywhere. If you slowly slide the seat stays out, you'll be able to grab on to all of the spacers that are there. And you can remove these, set them aside. So now that we have our seat stays out of the way, we're going to move forward up here to the shock mount bolts. Just grab your 5 millimeter wrench again and you can remove these. Again, there's some hardware in between the shock and the link. So once you get this last bolt out, you can carefully lift up the link and move your shock out of the way. And you'll see there's two spacers. You can use your Allen wrench to just push them out into your hand. Set these aside for later. And the last bolt to remove is the main pivot bolt here. It's a 6mm wrench, and just get this out of the way. When it's almost unthreaded, you can use this to push the bolt through so you can grab onto it and continue to unthread this. Pull your pivot out from the drive side. You might need to wiggle it a little bit. And that's it. There's no spacers on this pivot to worry about, so you can just move your link forward and out of the way. Once you have all the hardware off, now's a great time to clean all the old grease off and apply new grease. The new grease will help us stick the hardware to the bearings and make the install a little easier. Here we have all of our hardware. The wide side is set down with the narrow side facing up. The narrow side of these spacers is the face that's going to contact the bearings, and this is where we will apply the grease. I'm using a little grease gun and just applying a couple drops on each surface. You could definitely use your finger or a brush or something else to accomplish the same task. We'll also apply a couple drops of grease to our shock hardware here. Again, just a couple drops of grease. Now that we have this grease, we're ready to get everything installed again. All right, so we're ready to install the link. This is where some people might run into some hangups that might slow them down. So on this particular bike, you'll notice that the carbon on the frame around the bearings is a little bit wider than the bearings itself, which can make it incredibly hard, if not impossible, to get the link onto the bearings without scratching or chipping your paint. That's okay, we've got a solution for that. All right, so if the link doesn't fit over the bearing surround on your bike, it's not a big deal. What we're going to do is we're going to loosen the 4 bolts on one side of the link. We don't need to remove them the entire way, we just need to loosen them a bit. This will give us the clearance we need to get the link over the bearings on some specific frames. So as you can see, the bolts are loose. It gives us that little bit of wiggle room needed. So what we'll do now is put the link through, work it over our bearings here, and insert our main pivot. This part can be tricky as sometimes the inner bearing spacer can be a little loose and drop down. So you'll need to finagle it. All right, now once you have your main pivot through, you're good to go here, and we'll thread on the other part of the hardware until it just contacts. All right. Now, we loosened up these 4 bolts. Now is the time to snug them back up. So grab your T25 wrench, snug them all back up. If you took them all the way out, you can put a drop of blue Loctite on there before threading them all back in. And we'll take this opportunity to torque them all to 5 Newton meters. so we don't forget later. All right. The next step in getting the link installed on your bike is getting the shock back in place. So we'll take our shock spacers here and we'll use the grease that we recently put on to help them stick to these bearings so we can get them in place. Now we just rotate our shock back up, rotate the link down so everything lines up, and get your hardware started. All right, so here comes the trickiest part of the install. It's getting your seat stays inserted into the link with all the hardware. So we've got all of our hardware that we just greased. So we'll grab the smaller of the two. The side that we greased goes on the inside. So we'll use our grease to stick that to the bearing. I find it's easier to do both of the inside pieces first. Now we'll grab our outer one, again, the small side facing the bearing. And this one you'll probably have to hold with your hand as well. And we have this outer one. So once you have all your spacers in place, now the hard part is getting this all inserted into the link without losing any hardware. It's tricky as you'll have to pinch everything and hold it in place. We slide it into the link. Fortunately, once you get everything in, it usually stays. If you need to, you can use an Allen wrench fed through to kind of help you keep everything aligned. Now the goal here is to at least get the inner spacer and bearing lined up, and then you can get the outer one adjusted as needed. Sometimes wiggling it helps. And then you can see right here, we can use our Allen wrench to push this outer bearing spacer and get that aligned to get our hardware all the way in. All right, now once you have the hardware mostly in, you'll notice that there are flat sides on this back hardware here. These sides are meant to sit into the link, so you can grab your Allen wrench, rotate it slowly until it sits into the link right there. And you'll want to do that on both sides. If you have a process that is model year 2018, it's likely that your hardware right here will be round and won't have the flats. To make that work with our link, you'll have to get with your Kona dealer and get the seat stay hardware that has the flat sides on it. All right, now that you have your seat stay pivot hardware installed, you can install these outer pieces here. And you can snug them up. All right, now that you have these snug, the next step is to go through and torque everything to the manufacturer's spec. And now we're gonna go through and torque all of the bolts to spec. Reach out to your local Kona dealer and they can provide you with all the torque spec information that you need. All right, now that your bolts are torqued to spec, we're going to install these fixing screws. It's a 3mm wrench. And just install all 3 of these and snug them up. All right, now that we have the link on, we're gonna reinstall our rear wheel. All right, so now that we have everything installed, we're going to pull our bike down and make sure all of our clearances are adequate. To make sure our clearance is adequate, if you have an air shock, you're going to remove all the air. If you have a coil shock, you're going to remove the coil spring, and then you'll replace the bottom out bumper and spring retainer on the bottom. Okay, once you have all the air let out of your shock, just gonna slowly compress the suspension, making sure that you have adequate clearance at your down tube. And you wanna also make sure that you have adequate clearance up here at your seat stay bridge. You should have about 5 or so millimeters of clearance there. And we're good to go. Once you've checked for clearance, the next step is to reinstall the spring on your shock or air your shock back up. And just like when you bought the bike, make sure that you have 30% sag, go ride and have fun. Well, there you have it. That concludes the install of the Cascade Components Process 153 link on this Kona Process 153. For more information on this link or any of the other links we produce, check out our website at cascadecomponents.bike. Hope to see you out on the trail.